Just so you'll know where we are in our Bibles, we have now gone through Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges. We didn't really talk about Ruth. We've gone through 1 Samuel, and we're now up to 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. We're coming into 1 Kings chapter 12, when Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam takes over. Now, Rehoboam grew up in the household of Solomon. You would think he would have learned some wisdom, but he really didn't. And during the reign of Solomon, this is going to sound real familiar to all of us here, taxes had gone through the roof. And I don't know whether Solomon was a Democrat or a Republican, but he really taxed the people because he had some incredible building projects going on, and it was a rich nation, and so he taxed them. And during his lifetime, a man named Jeroboam had come to Solomon and said, "You got to back off on all this." And Solomon thought Jeroboam was a threat to him, so Jeroboam fled to Egypt. And after Solomon died, Rehoboam, his son, was on the throne. And it's kind of unfortunate that Rehoboam and Jeroboam met each other because their names sound so much alike you probably think they're twins, but they weren't related at all. And Jeroboam came in before Rehoboam, and he said, with all of the Israelites behind him, Jeroboam said, "You got to ease up. I mean, Solomon taxed the daylights out of us, and it's time for you to have a new regime that's a little more receptive to our ideas and a little more responsible, and a lot less spending must take place here for us to be happy." So Rehoboam, and this seems like it'd be wise, he went to two groups of people. He went to the older wise men who had served his father Solomon. And he said, "What should I do?" Here's what Jeroboam says. And the old men said what they should have said to Solomon, but they didn't. "Yeah, you probably ought to ease up. I mean, you really need to. There's a lot of people out there and they're unhappy, and you probably ought to cut taxes." And then he went to his young friends, his peers, and he said to his buddies, "What should I do?" And they said, no, you don't give any quarter. You're the king. You are the man. And you don't give in to them at all, because if you give in to them on this, you're going to be giving in to them all the time. Sound familiar? Sounds like politicians, doesn't it? You can't give in. You've got to be tough. If you give an inch, they'll take a mile. And so here's what you need to tell them. And Rehoboam came back in. And he said, "Jeroboam, come here. I've made my decision." Old men are over here listening. Come on, Rehoboam. Say the right thing. Young men are over here saying, "Come on, hang tough, hang tough." And he says to Jeroboam, "My father punished you with whips. I will punish you with scorpions." That's like a cat of nine tails. He says, "I have more muscle and strength in this little finger than my father had in his thigh. So you take that message to your people." And Jeroboam turned to the people behind him and he said this, simple words, "To your tents, O Israel." And they were gone. And I'm sure Rehoboam, as he heard them and the door closing, and he's in an empty room, said, "I think I made a tactical error here." Jeroboam took 10 of those tribes. You know those tribal sections? He took 10 of them with him and created a brand new nation. He called it Israel. And that's the name that the nation had always had. He took their rightful name and he called it Israel. And he set himself up as king. And he said, "We're not going to Jerusalem anymore for sacrifices and for temple worship. I will build you new altars at Dan and Bethel." That's on the opposite ends of his nation. Dan in the south, Bethel up top. Opposite. Bethel down south, Dan up top. We'll set those up and you can worship here because it's too much to go to Jerusalem. And from that time on, Judah, which now was the southern nation because it was the dominant tribe, the kingly tribe, the tribe of David and Solomon and Rehoboam, they set up in the south and tried to hold things together. Now up north, it was chaos. I mean, it was bad king after bad king. If Disney ever needed more villains, all they had to do is go to Israel and pick any king. Because there are horrible kings up there. I mean, they even have horrible names. Ahab. You know. The bad kings are in the north. Now, in the south, they had some good kings and some bad kings, and then another good king, and then another bad king. And they would come back to God, and then they'd drift from God. So you've got this downward spiral for Israel, and this seesaw for Judah in the south. And during this time, God started sending prophets to those nations. Prophets, the word means mouth of God. And those prophets were sent to the nations so that they could tell them, you need to turn back to God. That was a pretty consistent message by the prophets. Turn or burn, repent or perish. The prophets gave hard messages to their people. But then they also coupled it with this, and if you come back, your God is going to love you. And He's going to cherish you. And He will never forget you. Return, O Israel. Come, let's reason together. So all the prophets from Isaiah, and Jeremiah, and Daniel, and Ezekiel, and Hosea, and Jonah, and Micah, and Nahum, Habakkuk, Malachi, Zephaniah, and Zechariah, Obadiah. These prophets are all sent to say, come back to God. Come back to God. And many of them were punished. They were jailed. They were killed. They were prosecuted because the rulers had no desire to hear what they said, for the most part. Israel, that northern nation, was taken into captivity by the mighty Assyrian army. And they fell to the Assyrians in 722 BC, 722 years before the birth of Christ. Israel fell to the Assyrians. And the Assyrians just gathered up the Israelites and scattered them into other nations and then brought their own people down to occupy that land. And the people that were brought in to occupy the land intermarried with the Jews that were there, and they became the people we know in the New Testament times as the Samaritans. Now the reason they're despised by the Jews is because they're half-breeds. They have some Jewish blood in them, but they intermarried with these other nations. Judah, on the other hand, stood firm until 612. And in 612 BC, Babylon came. Nebuchadnezzar came and conquered Judah and took their people off into captivity. And a couple of the books of the prophets have to do with the time they spent in captivity in Babylon. Daniel is a notable book for that. And then in the days of King Cyrus of Persia, Babylon fell to Persia, the Medo-Persian Empire, in the days of King Cyrus for a reason that does not make sense except that God prophesied it would happen, even by name. Named Cyrus. He said, in the days of my servant Cyrus, you will return to the land. And so the Israelites who had been gone for 70 years from their land came back, rebuilt the city of Jerusalem, rebuilt the temple there, and began to reoccupy their land and try to put things back together and come back to God. One thing I want to remind you of that you may not know. After the Babylonian captivity, Israel and the Israelites never had a problem with idolatry. They had learned that lesson. Idolatry didn't pay for them. They never again went after idols like that. They'll have other problems, but they learned a lesson from that. Now that brings us to the end of the Old Testament. At the end of the Old Testament, my Bible has it, and I'm sure yours does too. At the very end of Malachi and before Matthew, I've got this blank page. That blank page represents 400 years between the last message God ever gave through Malachi and the new message He will give in the New Testament. There are 400 years of history that the Bible doesn't speak of at all. During that time, the Greeks will come to power, and then the Romans, and then will come the Christ. Okay, quickly, what lessons should we take home from tonight's narration? Let me suggest 4 lessons for you that I think are really important for all of us. Lesson number 1, God will raise up another Moses. When Moses spoke in Deuteronomy chapter 18, he said, God will raise up a prophet like unto me, who will deliver His people. That prophet is going to be Jesus Christ. Moses is speaking of another one who will be like him, a deliverer to bring His people out of bondage. Secondly, God is establishing rules for His people. Why? So they can approach Him in the holiness that He desires and maintains for Himself. God's laws are not meant to be oppressive. They are meant to help us to live like God intended us to live. His laws have always been that way, and they reflect His holiness and His exactness in all things. Third, God punishes sin. We didn't talk much about God's punishment of Moses, that Moses wouldn't get to see the promised land because he had disobeyed God and hadn't treated Him as holy. We talked briefly about David's sin with Bathsheba, but he suffered greatly for that and even lost a child over it. And every member of his household fought against him for that. And Israel and Judah, though they were nations that belonged to God, when they sinned against Him, God punished them for that sin. God doesn't play favorites with people. He punishes sin because sin deserves punishment. And finally, all over this Old Testament, God is leaving clues about the one to come. All the prophets spoke of this prophet to come, this period of wonderful, wonderful blessings that would come for them. That the deserts would be turned into lush places, and that waters would run in the deserts, and that God would bless His people again, and that He would raise up one called the Messiah, the anointed one, the chosen of God. Lord allowing us to be together tomorrow night, we will begin our story with the coming of that Messiah. Would you join me in a prayer, Lord, please? Lord,